Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
The most important thing to know about Madison in the years preceding the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was that he spent 7 years involved in intense deliberations. First, 3.5 years in the Continental Congress, from the spring of 1780 to the fall of 1783, and then 3 successive terms in the Virginia House of Delegates, the lower house of the Virginia legislature, 1784, 1785, and 1786. And from those 2 sets of experiences, Madison drew a number of very powerful conclusions about the nature both of federal government, about the relationship of the states to the nation, and also about the nature of legislative deliberation within the states. So Madison, one has to recognize that the Continental Congress was a kind of curious body. The powers it exercised in the 18th century would have been regarded as being essentially executive in nature. That's to say, powers over war and diplomacy. But it conducted itself very much like a legislature. It had roll calls, it had committees, it followed parliamentary procedures in terms of how decisions were reached and discussed. And so Madison thought a lot about the nature of collective deliberation at the national level of politics on the basis of that experience. And then he was term limited out of Congress in the fall of 1783. Anybody who ever thinks about term limits and their role in American history should pause to recognize that Madison was actually the first legislative victim of term limits in American history, because he'd served the 3 years out of 6 that set the limit. So he was term limited out of Congress and goes back to Virginia, and almost immediately is elected to represent Orange County, the county where his house Montpelier is situated, at the state capitol in Richmond. And when Madison went off to Richmond in 1784 to serve his first term in the legislature, he became almost immediately the dominant figure in the Virginia Assembly. And he pretty much retained that status over the next 3 years. There was a point, Madison was so earnest a politician and so assiduous in pursuing the items he felt were really important that he wore out the patience of many of his colleagues. One point, one delegate says that there's no better way to doom a measure than to have Madison supported. But that, I think, was more the exception to his participation there. So he had 3.5 years in Congress and 3 years in Virginia, really thinking about the nature of collective deliberation. Madison was first and foremost a legislator. He was first and foremost a man who derived his political experience from engaging in collective deliberation in bodies that were either legislative in nature or at least followed legislative procedures. So he thought an awful lot about the nature of collective decision-making in a Republican society. A lot of what concerned him had to do with the kind of internal processes of a legislative body, how committees operated, how you could get people to focus on the central issue in a debate. But the more he served, and particularly once he started serving back in Virginia, he also started thinking about the way in which what we might call popular inputs, the role that the people out of doors, or the people at large, or the people themselves would play in terms of conditioning and shaping and influencing legislative debate. That became increasingly one of his concerns by, let's say, 1786, the year before the Constitutional Convention. So when Madison went off to Philadelphia in the spring of 1787, for the great event of the Constitutional Convention, he had, in a sense, 2 sets of concerns on his mind. One was he really didn't want to improve the nature of legislative deliberation. For example, if you think about the 2-year term that members of the House of Representatives serve, the real point of that was that members would, in effect, have to learn their job while they were doing it. Madison assumed, in fact, correctly, that most members of Congress would come and go, that they would serve 1 or 2 terms. They would not be veteran lawmakers. It would be nothing at all like the modern Congress where people serve term after term after term after term. Madison assumed that for much of the time, lawmakers would in fact be amateurs. They would come to the national government and they would really have to learn what they were doing only in the process of doing it. So having a 2-year term would be really helpful. But he also worried a lot about the impact of popular politics, or what he would call the interests, the opinions, and the passions of ordinary citizens on legislative deliberations. And the more he thought about this, the more concerned he grew with thinking about how do you, to some extent, how do you insulate lawmakers from the excessive influence of popular opinion.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.